Chapter 9 of Evan David by Honoré de Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 9. To return to Lucien in Paris. On the morrow of the loss announced in his letter, he obtained a visa for his passport, bought a stout holly stick, and went to the Rue d'Enfer to take a place in the little market van which took him as far as Longjumeau for half a franc. He was going home to Angoulême. At the end of the first day's tramp he slept in a cowshed 2 leagues from Arpajon. He had come no farther than Orléans before he was very weary and almost ready to break down, but there he found a boatman willing to bring him as far as Tours for 3 francs, and food during the journey cost him but 40 sous. 5 days of walking brought him from Tours to Poitiers, and left him with but 5 francs in his pockets, but he summoned up all his remaining strength for the journey before him. He was overtaken by night in the open country, and had made up his mind to sleep out of doors, when a travelling carriage passed by, slowly climbing the hillside, and, all unknown to the postillion, the occupants, and the servant, he managed to slip in among the luggage, crouching in between 2 trunks lest he should be shaken off by the jolting of the carriage. And so he slept. He awoke with the sun shining into his eyes and the sound of voices in his ears. The carriage had come to a standstill. Looking about him, he knew that he was at Mansle, the little town where he had waited for Madame de Bargeton 18 months before, when his heart was full of hope and love and joy. A group of postboys eyed him curiously and suspiciously, covered with dust as he was, wedged in among the luggage. Lucien jumped down, but before he could speak, 2 travelers stepped out of the calèche, and the words died away on his lips. For there stood the new prefect of the Charente, Sixte du Châtelet, and his wife, Louise de Negrepelisse. "Chance gave us a travelling companion, if we had but known," said the Countess. "Come in with us, monsieur." Lucien gave the couple a distant bow and a half-fumbled, half-defiant glance. Then he turned away into a cross-country road in search of some farmhouse where he might make a breakfast on milk and bread, and rest awhile, and think quietly over the future. He still had 3 francs left. On and on he walked with the hurrying pace of fever, noticing as he went, down by the riverside, that the country grew more and more picturesque. It was near midday when he came upon a sheet of water with willows growing about the margin, and stopped for a while to rest his eyes on the cool, thick-growing leaves, and something of the grace of the fields entered into his soul. In among the crests of the willows he caught a glimpse of a mill near by on a branch stream, and of the thatched roof of the mill house where the house leeks were growing. For all ornament, the quaint cottage was covered with jessamine and honeysuckle and climbing hops, and the garden about it was gay with phloxes and tall, juicy-leaved plants. Nets lay drying in the sun along a paved causeway, raised above the highest flood level, and secured by massive piles. Ducks were swimming in the clear mill pond below the currents of water roaring over the wheel. As the poet came nearer, he heard the clack of the mill, and saw the good-natured, homely woman of the house knitting on a garden bench, and keeping an eye upon a little one who was chasing the hens about. Lucien came forward. "My good woman," he said, "I am tired out, I have a fever on me, and I have only 3 francs. Will you undertake to give me brown bread and milk, and let me sleep in the barn for a week? I shall have time to write to my people, and they will either come to fetch me or send me money." "I am quite willing, always supposing that my husband has no objection. Hey, little man!" The miller came up, gave Lucien a look over, and took his pipe out of his mouth to remark, "3 francs for a week's board? You might as well pay nothing at all." "Perhaps I shall end as a miller's man," thought the poet, as his eyes wandered over the lovely country. Then the miller's wife made a bed ready for him, and Lucien lay down and slept so long that his hostess was frightened. "Courtois," she said next day at noon, "just go in and see whether that young man is dead or alive. He has been lying there these 14 hours." The miller was busy spreading out his fishing nets and lines. "It is my belief," he said, "that the pretty fellow yonder is some starveling play actor, without a brass farthing to bless himself with." "What makes you think that, little man?" asked the mistress of the mill. "Lord, he is not a prince, nor a lord, nor a member of parliament, nor a bishop. Why are his hands as white as if he did nothing?" "Then it is very strange that he does not feel hungry and wake up," retorted the miller's wife. She had just prepared breakfast for yesterday's chance guest. "A play actor, is he?" she continued. "Where will he be going? It is too early yet for the fair at Angouleme." But neither the miller nor his wife suspected that, actors, princes, and bishops apart, there is a kind of being who is both prince and actor, and invested besides with a magnificent order of priesthood; that the poet seems to do nothing, yet reigns over all humanity when he can paint humanity. "What can he be?" Courtois asked of his wife. "Suppose it should be dangerous to take him in?" queried she. "Pooh! Thieves look more alive than that. We should have been robbed by this time," returned her spouse. "I am neither a prince, nor a thief, nor a bishop, nor an actor," Lucien said wearily. He must have overheard the colloquy through the window, and now he suddenly appeared. "I am poor, I am tired out. I have come on foot from Paris. My name is Lucien de Rubempre, and my father was Monsieur Chardon, who used to have Postel's business in L'Houmeau. My sister married David Séchard, the printer in the Place du Murier at Angouleme." "Stop a bit," said the miller. "That printer is the son of the old skinflint who farms his own land at Marsac, isn't he?" "The very same," said Lucien. "He is a queer kind of father, he is," Courtois continued. "He is worth 200,000 francs and more, without counting his money box, and he has sold his son up, they say." When body and soul have been broken by a prolonged painful struggle, there comes a crisis when a strong nature braces itself for greater effort, but those who give way under the strain either die or sink into unconsciousness like death. That hour of crisis had struck for Lucien. At the vague rumor of the catastrophe that had befallen David, he seemed almost ready to succumb. "Oh, my sister!" he cried. "O God, what have I done? Base wretch that I am!" He dropped down on the wooden bench, looking white and powerless as a dying man. The miller's wife brought out a bowl of milk and made him drink, but he begged the miller to help him back to his bed, and asked to be forgiven for bringing a dying man into their house. He thought his last hour had come. With the shadow of death, thoughts of religion crossed a brain so quick to conceive picturesque fancies. He would see the Curiae, he would confess and receive the last sacraments. The moan, uttered in the faint voice by a young man with such a comely face and figure, went to Madame Courtois' heart. "I say, little man, just take the horse and go to Marsac and ask Dr. Marron to come and see this young man. He's in a very bad way, it seems to me. And you might bring the cure as well. Perhaps they may know more about that printer in the Place du Murier than you do, for Postel married Monsieur Marron's daughter." Courtois departed. The miller's wife tried to make Lucien take food. Like all country-bred folk, she was full of the idea that sick folk must be made to eat. He took no notice of her, but gave way to a violent storm of remorseful grief, a kind of mental process of counter-irritation, which relieved him. The Courtois' mill lies a league away from Marsac, the town of the district, and the halfway between Mansle and Angouleme, so it was not long before the good miller came back with the doctor and the cure. Both functionaries had heard rumors coupling Lucien's name with the name of Madame de Bargeton, and now, when the whole department was talking of the lady's marriage to the new prefect, and her return to Angoulême as the Comtesse du Châtelet, both cure and doctor were consumed with a violent curiosity to know why Monsieur de Bargeton's widow had not married the young poet with whom she had left Angoulême. And when they heard, furthermore, that Lucien was at the mill, they were eager to know whether the poet had come to the rescue of his brother-in-law. Curiosity and humanity alike prompted them to go at once to the dying man. 2 hours after Courtois set out, Lucien heard the rattle of old iron over the stony causeway, the country doctor's ramshackle chaise came up to the door, and out stepped Messieurs Marron, for the cure was the doctor's uncle. Lucien's bedside visitors were as intimate with David's father as country neighbors usually are in a small vine-growing township. The doctor looked at the dying man, felt his pulse and examined his tongue, then he looked at the miller's wife and smiled reassuringly. "Madame Courtois," said he, "if, as I do not doubt, you have a bottle of good wine somewhere in the cellar, and a fat eel in your fish pond, put them before your patient. It is only exhaustion, there's nothing the matter with him. Our great man will be on his feet again directly." "Ah, monsieur," said Lucien, "it is not the body, it is the mind that ails. These good people have told me tidings that nearly killed me. I have just heard the bad news of my sister, Madame Sechard. Madame Courtois says that your daughter is married to Postel, monsieur, so you must know something of David Sechard's affairs. Oh, for heaven's sake, monsieur, tell me what you know." "Why, he must be in prison," began the doctor. "His father would not help him." "In prison!" repeated Lucien. "And why?" "Because some bills came from Paris. He had overlooked them, no doubt, for he does not pay much attention to his business, they say," said Dr. Marron. "Pray leave me with monsieur le cure," said the poet, with a visible change of countenance. The doctor and the miller and his wife went out of the room, and Lucien was left alone with the old priest. "Sir," he said, "I feel that death is near, and I deserve to die. I am a very miserable wretch. I can only cast myself into the arms of religion. I, sir, I have brought all these troubles on my sister and brother, for David Sechard has been a brother to me. I drew those bills that David could not meet. I have ruined him. In my terrible misery I forgot the crime. A millionaire put an end to the proceedings, and I quite believed that he had met the bills, but nothing of the kind has been done, it seems." And Lucien told the tale of his sorrows. The story, as he told it in his feverish excitement, was worthy of the poet. He besought the cure to go to Angoulême and to ask for news of Eve and his mother, Madame Chardon, and to let him know the truth, and whether it was still possible to repair the evil. "I shall live till you come back, sir," he added, as the hot tears fell. "If my mother and sister and David do not cast me off, I shall not die." Lucien's remorse was terrible to see. The tears, the eloquence, the young white face with the heartbroken, despairing look, the tales of sorrow upon sorrow, till human strength could no more endure, all these things aroused the cure's pity and interest. "In the provinces, as in Paris," he said, "you must believe only half of all that you hear. Do not alarm yourself. A piece of hearsay 3 leagues away from Angoulême is sure to be far from the truth. Old Sechard, our neighbor, left Marsac some days ago. Very likely he is busy settling his son's difficulties. I am going to Angoulême. I will come back and tell you whether you can return home. Your confessions and repentance will help to plead your cause." The cure did not know that Lucien had repented so many times during the last 18 months that penitence, however impassioned, had come to be a kind of drama with him, played to perfection, played so far in all good faith, but none the less a drama. To the cure succeeded the doctor. He saw that the patient was passing through a nervous crisis, and the danger was beginning to subside. The doctor nephew spoke as comfortably as the cure uncle, and at length the patient was persuaded to take nourishment. Meanwhile, the cure, knowing the manners and customs of the countryside, had gone to Mansle. The coach from Ruffec to Angoulême was due to pass about that time, and he found a vacant place in it. He would go to his grandnephew Postel in L'Houmeau, David's former rival, and make inquiries of him. From the assiduity with which the little druggist assisted his venerable relative to alight from the abominable cage which did duty as a coach between Ruffec and Angoulême, it was apparent to the meanest understanding that Monsieur and Madame Postel founded their hopes of future ease upon the old cure's will. "Have you breakfasted? Will you take something? We did not in the least expect you. This is a pleasant surprise." Out came questions innumerable in a breath. Madame Postel might have been born to be the wife of an apothecary in L'Houmeau. She was a common-looking woman, about the same height as little Postel himself, such good looks as she possessed being entirely due to youth and health. Her florid auburn hair grew very low upon her forehead. Her demeanor and language were in keeping with homely features, a round countenance, the red cheeks of a country damsel, and eyes that might almost be described as yellow. Everything about her said plainly enough that she had been married for expectations of money. After a year of married life, therefore, she ruled the house, and Postel, only too happy to have discovered the heiress, meekly submitted to his wife. Madame Léonie Postel, née Marron, was nursing her first child, the darling of the old cure, the doctor, and Postel, a repulsive infant, with a strong likeness to both parents. "Well, uncle," said Léonie, "what has brought you to Angoulême, since you will not take anything, and no sooner come in than you talk of going?" But when the venerable ecclesiastic brought out the names of David Séchard and Ève, little Postel grew very red, and Léonie, his wife, felt it incumbent upon her to give him a jealous glance, the glance that a wife never fails to give when she is perfectly sure of her husband, and gives a look into the past by way of a caution for the future. "What have yonder folk done to you, uncle, that you should mix yourself up in their affairs?" inquired Léonie, with very perceptible tartness. "They are in trouble, my girl," said the cure, and he told the Postels about Lucien at the Courtois' mill. "Oh, so that is the way he came back from Paris, is it?" exclaimed Postel. "Yet he had some brains, poor fellow, and he was ambitious too. He went out to look for wool, and comes home shorn. But what does he want here? His sister is frightfully poor. For all these geniuses, David and Lucien alike, know very little about business. There was some talk of him at the tribunal, and as judge I was obliged to sign the warrant of execution. It was a painful duty. I do not know whether the sister's circumstances are such that Lucien can go to her, but in any case the little room that he used to occupy here is at liberty, and I shall be pleased to offer it to him." "That is right, Postel," said the priest. He bestowed a kiss on the infant slumbering in Léonie's arms, and adjusting his cocked hat, prepared to walk out of the shop. "You will dine with us, uncle, of course," said Madame Postel. "If once you meddle in these people's affairs, it will be some time before you have done. My husband will drive you back again in his little pony cart." Husband and wife stood watching their valued aged relative on his way into Angoulême. "He carries himself well for his age, all the same," remarked the druggist. By this time David had been in hiding for 11 days in a house only 2 doors away from the druggist's shop, which the worthy ecclesiastic had just quitted to climb the steep path into Angoulême with the news of Lucien's present condition. When the Abbe Marron debouched upon the Place de Murier, he found 3 men, each one remarkable in his own way, and all of them bearing with their whole weight upon the present and future of the hapless voluntary prisoner. There stood old Séchard, the tall Cointet, and his confederate, the puny limb of the law. Three men representing three phases of greed, as widely different as the outward forms of the speakers. The first had it in his mind to sell his own son, the second to betray his client, and the third, while bargaining for both iniquities, was inwardly resolved to pay for neither. It was nearly 5 o'clock. Passers-by on their way home to dinner stopped a moment to look at the group. "What the devil can old Séchard and the tall Cointet have to say to each other?" asked the more curious. "There was something on foot concerning that miserable wretch that leaves his wife and child and mother-in-law to starve," suggested some. "Talk of sending a boy to Paris to learn his trade," said a provincial oracle. "Monsieur le Curé, what brings you here, eh?" exclaimed old Séchard, catching sight of the Abbe as soon as he appeared. "I have come on account of your family," answered the old man. "Here is another of my son's notions," exclaimed old Séchard. "It would not cost you much to make everybody happy all round," said the priest, looking at the windows of the printing house. Madame Séchard's beautiful face appeared at that moment between the curtains. She was hushing her child's cries by tossing him in her arms and singing to him. "Are you bringing news of my son?" asked old Séchard. "Or, what is more to the purpose, money?" "No," answered Monsieur Marron. "I am bringing the sister news of her brother." "Of Lucien?" cried Petit Claud. "Yes, he walked all the way from Paris, poor young man. I found him at the Courtois' house. He was worn out with misery and fatigue. Oh, he is very much to be pitied." Petit Claud took the tall Cointet by the arm, saying aloud, "If we are going to dine with Madame de Senonches, it is time to dress." When they had come away a few paces, he added, for his companion's benefit, "Catch the cub, and you will soon have the dam. We have David now." "I have found you a wife, find me a partner," said the tall Cointet with a treacherous smile. "Lucien is an old schoolfellow of mine; we used to be chums. I shall be sure to hear something from him in a week's time. Have the banns put up, and I will engage to put David in prison. When he is on the jailer's register, I shall have done my part." "Ah!" exclaimed the tall Cointet under his breath, "we might have the patent taken out in our name. That would be the thing." A shiver ran through the meagre little attorney when he heard those words. Meanwhile Eve beheld her father-in-law enter with the Abbe Marron, who had let fall a word which unfolded the whole tragedy. "Here is our cure, Madame Séchard," the old man said, addressing his daughter-in-law, "and pretty tales about your brother he has to tell us, no doubt." "Oh!" cried poor Eve, cut to the heart. "What can have happened now?" The cry told so unmistakably of many sorrows, of great dread on so many grounds, that the Abbe Marron made haste to say, "Reassure yourself, madame, he is living." Eve turned to the vine grower. "Father," she said, "perhaps you will be good enough to go to my mother; she must hear all that this gentleman has to tell us of Lucien." The old man went in search of Madame Chardon, and addressed her in this wise: "Go and have it out with the Abbe Marron. He is a good sort, priest though he is. Dinner will be late, no doubt. I shall come back again in an hour." And the old man went out. Insensible as he was to everything but the clink of money and the glitter of gold, he left Madame Chardon without caring to notice the effect of the shock that he had given her. Madame Chardon had changed so greatly during the last 18 months that in that short time she no longer looked like the same woman. The troubles hanging over both of her children, her abortive hopes for Lucien, the unexpected deterioration in one whose powers and honesty she had for so long believed, all these things had told heavily upon her. Madame Chardon was not only noble by birth, she was noble by nature. She idolized her children. Consequently, during the last 6 months, she had suffered as never before since her widowhood. Lucien might have borne the name of Lucien de Rubempre by royal letters patent. He might have founded the family anew, revived the title, and borne the arms. He might have been made a great name. He had thrown the chance away. Nay, he had fallen into the mire. For Madame Chardon the mother was a harder judge than Eve the sister. When she heard of the bills, she looked upon Lucien as lost. A mother is often fain to shut her eyes, but she always knows the child that she held at her breast, the child that has been always with her in the house. And so when Eve and David discussed Lucien's chances of success in Paris, and Lucien's mother to all appearance shared Eve's illusions, in her inmost heart there was a tremor of fear lest David should be right, for a mother's consciousness bore a witness to the truth of his words. So well did she know Eve's sensitive nature that she could not bring herself to speak of her fears. She was obliged to choke them down and keep such silence as mothers alone can keep when they know how to love their children. And Eve, on her side, had watched her mother, and saw the ravages of hidden grief with a feeling of dread. Her mother was not growing old, she was failing from day to day. Mother and daughter lived a life of generous deception, and neither was deceived. The brutal old vine-grower's speech was the last drop that filled the cup of affliction to overflowing. The words struck a chill to Madame Chardon's heart. "Here is my mother, monsieur," said Eve, and the abbe, looking up, saw a white-haired woman with a face as thin and worn as the features of some aged nun, and yet grown beautiful with the calm and sweet expression that devout submission gives to the faces of women who walk by the will of God, as the saying is. Then the abbe understood the lives of the mother and daughter, and had no more sympathy left for Lucien. He shuddered to think of all that the victims had endured. "Mother," said Eve, drying her eyes as she spoke, "poor Lucien is not very far away. He is at Marsac." "And why is he not here?" asked Madame Chardon. Then the abbe told the whole story as Lucien had told it to him, the misery of the journey, the troubles of the last days in Paris. He described the poet's agony of mind when he heard of the havoc wrought at home by his imprudence, and his apprehension as to the reception awaiting him at Angouleme. "He has doubts of us. Has it come to this?" said Madame Chardon. "The unhappy young man has come back to you on foot, enduring the most terrible hardships by the way. He is prepared to enter the humblest walks in life, if so he may make reparation." "Monsieur," Lucien's sister said, "in spite of the wrong he has done us, I love my brother still, as we love the dead body when the soul has left it. And even so I love him more than many sisters love their brothers. He has made us poor indeed, but let him come to us. He shall share the last crust of bread, anything indeed that he has left us. Oh, if he had never left us, monsieur, we should not have lost our heart's treasure." "And the woman who took him from us brought him back on her carriage," exclaimed Madame Chardon. "He went away sitting by Madame de Bargeton's side in her caleche, and he came back behind it." "Can I do anything for you?" asked the good cure, seeking an opportunity to take leave. "A wound in the purse is not fatal, they say, monsieur," said Madame Chardon, "but the patient must be his own doctor." "If you have sufficient influence with my father-in-law to induce him to help his son, you would save a whole family," said Eve. "He has no belief in you, and he seemed to me to be very much exasperated against your husband," answered the old cure. He retained an impression from the ex-pressman's rambling talk that the Seychards' affairs were a kind of wasp's nest with which it was imprudent to meddle, and, his mission being fulfilled, he went to dine with his nephew Postel. That worthy, like the rest of Angouleme, maintained that the father was in the right, and soon dissipated any little benevolence that the old gentleman was disposed to feel towards the son and his family. "With those that squander money, something may be done," concluded little Postel, "but those that make experiments are the ruin of you." End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Eve and David by Honoré de Balzac, translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 10. The cure went home. His curiosity was thoroughly satisfied, and this is the end and object of the exceeding interest taken in other people's business in the provinces. In the course of the evening the poet was duly informed of all that had passed in the Seychard family, and the journey was represented as a pilgrimage undertaken from motives of the purest charity. "You have run your brother-in-law and sister into debt to the amount of 10 or 12,000 francs," said the Abbe as he drew to an end, "and nobody hereabouts has that trifling amount to lend a neighbor, my dear sir. We are not rich in Angoumois. When you spoke to me of your bills, I thought that a much smaller amount was involved." Lucien thanked the old man for his good offices. "The promise of forgiveness which you have brought is for me a priceless gift." Very early the next morning Lucien set out from Marsac, and reached Angouleme towards 9 o'clock. He carried nothing but his walking stick. The short jacket that he wore was considerably the worst for his journey. His black trousers were whitened with dust, and a pair of worn boots told sufficiently plainly that their owner belonged to the hapless tribe of tramps. He knew well that the contrast between his departure and return was bound to strike his fellow townsmen. He did not try to hide the fact from himself. But just then, with his heart swelling beneath the oppression of remorse awakened in him by the old cure's story, he accepted his punishment for the moment, and made up his mind to brave the eyes of his acquaintances. Within himself he said, "I am behaving heroically." Poetic temperaments of this stamp begin as their own dupes. He walked up through L'Houmeau, shame at the manner of his return, struggling with the charm of old associations as he went. His heart beat quickly as he passed Postel's shop, but, very luckily for him, the only persons inside it were Leonie and her child. And yet vanity was still so strong in him that he could feel glad that his father's name had been painted out on the shop front. For Postel, since his marriage, had redecorated his abode, and the word pharmacy now alone appeared there, in the Paris fashion, in big letters. When Lucien reached the steps by the Palais gate, he felt the influence of his native air; his misfortunes no longer weighed upon him. "I shall see them again," he said to himself, with a thrill of delight. He reached the Place du Murier and had not met a soul, a piece of luck that he scarcely hoped for, he who once had gone about his native place with a conqueror's air. Marion and Kolb, on guard at the door, flew out upon the steps, crying out, "Here he is!" Lucien saw the familiar workshop and courtyard, and on the staircase met his mother and sister, and for a moment, while their arms were about him, all three almost forgot their troubles. In family life we almost always compound with our misfortunes; we make a sort of bed to rest upon, and if it is hard, hope to make it tolerable. If Lucien looked the picture of despair, poetic charm was not wanting to the picture. His face had been tanned by the sunlight of the open road, and the deep sadness visible in his features overshadowed his poet's brow. The change in him told so plainly of sufferings endured. His face was so worn by sharp misery that no one could help pitying him. Imagination had fared forth into the world and found sad reality at the homecoming. Eve was smiling in the midst of her joy, as the saints smile upon martyrdom. The face of a young and very fair woman grows sublimely beautiful at the touch of grief. Lucien remembered the innocent girlish face that he saw last before he went to Paris, and the look of gravity that had come over it spoke so eloquently that he could not but feel a painful impression. The first quick, natural outpouring of affection was followed at once by a reaction on either side. They were afraid to speak. And when Lucien almost involuntarily looked round for another who should have been there, Eve burst into tears, and Lucien did the same. But Madame Chardon's haggard face showed no sign of emotion. Eve rose to her feet and went downstairs, partly to spare her brother a word of reproach, partly to speak to Marion. "Lucien is so fond of strawberries, child. We must find some strawberries for him." "Oh, I was sure that you would want to welcome Monsieur Lucien. You shall have a nice little breakfast and a good dinner too." "Lucien," said Madame Chardon, when the mother and son were left alone, "you have a great deal to repair here. You went away that we all might be proud of you. You have plunged us into want. You have all but destroyed your brother's opportunity of making a fortune that he only cared to win for the sake of his new family. Nor is this all that you have destroyed," said the mother. There was a dreadful pause. Lucien took his mother's reproaches in silence. "Now begin to work," Madame Chardon went on more gently. "You tried to revive the noble family of whom I come. I do not blame you for it. But the man who undertakes such a task needs money above all things, and must bear a high heart in him. Both were wanting in your case. We believed in you once; our belief has been shaken. This was a hard-working, contented household, making its way with difficulty. You have troubled their peace. The first offence may be forgiven, but it must be the last. We are in a very difficult position here. You must be careful, and take your sister's advice, Lucien. The school of trouble is a very hard one, but Eve has learned much by her lessons. She has grown grave and thoughtful. She is a mother. In her devotion to our dear David, she has taken all the family burdens upon herself. Indeed, through your wrongdoing, she has come to be my only comfort." "You might be still more severe, my mother," Lucien said as he kissed her. "I accept your forgiveness, for I will not need it a second time." Eve came into the room, saw her brother's humble attitude, and knew that he had been forgiven. Her kindness brought a smile for him to her lips, and Lucien answered with tear-filled eyes. A living presence acts like a charm, changing the most hostile positions of lovers or of families, no matter how just the resentment. Is it that affection finds out the ways of the heart, and we love to fall into them again? Does the phenomenon come within the province of the science of magnetism? Or is it reason that tells us that we must either forgive or never see each other again? Whether the cause be referred to mental, physical, or spiritual conditions, every one knows the effect. Every one has felt that the looks, the actions, or gestures of the beloved awaken some vestige of tenderness in those most deeply sinned against and grievously wronged. Though it is hard for the mind to forget, though we still smart under the injury, the heart returns to its allegiance in spite of all. Poor Eve listened to her brother's confidences until breakfast time, and whenever she looked at him, she was no longer mistress of her eyes. In that intimate talk she could not control her voice. And with the comprehension of the conditions of literary life in Paris, she understood that the struggle had been too much for Lucien's strength. The poet's delight as he caressed his sister's child, his deep grief over David's absence, mingled with joy at seeing his country and his own folk again, the melancholy words that he let fall, all these things combined to make that day a festival. When Marion brought in the strawberries, he was touched to see that Eve had remembered his taste, in spite of her distress, and she, his sister, must make ready a room for the prodigal brother and busy herself for Lucien. It was a truce, as it were, to misery. Old Séchard himself assisted to bring about this revulsion of feeling in the two women. "You are making as much of him as if he were bringing you any amount of money." "And what has my brother done that we should not make much of him?" cried Eve, jealously screening Lucien. Nevertheless, when the first expansion was over, shades of truth came out. It was not long before Lucien felt the difference between the old affection and the new. Eve respected David from the depths of her heart. Lucien was beloved for his own sake, as we love a mistress still in spite of the disasters she causes. Esteem, the very foundation on which affection is based, is the solid stuff to which affection owes I know not what of certainty and security by which we live, and this was lacking between Madame Chardon and her son, between the sister and the brother. Mother and daughter did not put entire confidence in him, as they would have done if he had not lost his honor, and he felt this. The opinion expressed in d'Arthez's letter was Eve's own estimate of her brother. Unconsciously she revealed it by her manner, tones, and gestures. Oh, Lucien was pitied, that was true; but as for all that he had been, the pride of the household, the great man of the family, the hero of the fireside, all this, like their fair hopes of him, was gone, never to return. They were so afraid of his heedlessness that he was not told where David was hidden. Lucien wanted to see his brother, but this Eve, insensible to the caresses which accompanied his curious questionings, was not the Eve of L'Houmeau, for whom a glance from him had been an order that must be obeyed. When Lucien spoke of making reparation, and talked as though he could rescue David, Eve only answered, "Do not interfere. We have enemies of the most treacherous and dangerous kind." Lucien tossed his head, as one who should say, "I have measured myself against Parisians." And the look in his sister's eyes said unmistakably, "Yes, but you were defeated." "Nobody cares for me now," Lucien thought. "In the home circle, as in the world without, success is a necessity." The poet tried to explain their lack of confidence in him. He had not been at home 2 days before a feeling of vexation, rather than of angry bitterness, gained hold on him. He applied Parisian standards to the quiet, temperate existence of the provinces, quite forgetting that the narrow, patient life of the household was the result of his own misdoings. "They are bourgeois, they cannot understand me," he said, setting himself apart from his sister and mother and David, now that they could no longer be deceived as to his real character and his future. Many troubles and shocks of fortune had quickened the intuitive sense in both the women. Eve and Madame Chardon guessed the thoughts in Lucien's inmost soul. They felt that he misjudged them; they saw him mentally isolating himself. "Paris has changed him very much," they said between themselves. They were indeed reaping the harvest of egoism which they themselves had fostered. It was inevitable but that the leaven should work in all three, and this most of all in Lucien, because he felt that he was so heavily to blame. As for Eve, she was just the kind of sister to beg an erring brother to forgive me for your trespasses. But when the union of two souls had been as perfect since life's very beginnings as it had been with Eve and Lucien, any blow dealt to that fair ideal is fatal. Scoundrels can draw knives on each other and make it up again afterwards, while a look or a word is enough to sunder two lovers forever. In the recollection of an almost perfect life of heart and heart lies the secret of many an estrangement that none can explain. Two may live together without full trust in their hearts, if only their past holds no memories of complete and unclouded love. But for those who once have known that intimate life, it becomes intolerable to keep perpetual watch over looks and words. Great poets know this. Paul et Virginie die before youth is over. Can we think of Paul et Virginie estranged? Let us know that, to the honor of Lucien and Eve, the grave injury done was not the source of the pain. It was entirely a matter of feeling upon either side, for the poet in fault, as for the sister who was in no way to blame. Things had reached the point when the slightest misunderstanding or little quarrel, or a fresh disappointment in Lucien, would end in final estrangement. Money difficulties may be arranged, but feelings are inexorable. Next day Lucien received a copy of the local paper. He turned pale with pleasure when he saw his name at the head of one of the first leaders in that highly respectable sheet, which, like the provincial academies that Voltaire compared to a well-bred miss, was never talked about. "Let Franche-Comté boast of giving the light to Victor Hugo, to Charles Nodier and Cuvier," ran the article. "Brittany of producing a Chateaubriand and a Lamennais, Normandy of Casimir Delavigne, and Touraine of the author of Eloa. Angoumois, that gave birth, in the days of Louis XIII., to our illustrious fellow countryman Guez, better known under the name of Balzac. Our Angoumois need no longer envy Limousin her Dupuytren, nor Auvergne, the country of Montlosier, nor Bordeaux, birthplace of so many great men, for we too have our poet. The writer of the beautiful sonnets entitled the Marguerite unites his poet's fame to the distinction of a prose writer, for to him we also owe the magnificent romance of the Archer of Charles IX. Some day our nephews will be proud to be the fellow townsmen of Lucien Chardon, a rival of Petrarch." The country newspapers of those days were sown with notes of admiration, as reports of English election speeches are studded with cheers in brackets. In spite of his brilliant success in Paris, our young poet has not forgotten the Hôtel de Bargeton, the cradle of his triumphs, nor the fact that the wife of Monsieur le Comte du Châtelet, our prefect, encouraged his early footsteps in the pathway of the Muses. He has come back among us once more. All L'Houmeau was thrown into excitement yesterday by the appearance of our Lucien de Rubempre. The news of his return produced a profound sensation throughout the town. Angoulême certainly will not allow L'Houmeau to be beforehand in doing honor to the poet who in journalism and literature has so gloriously represented our town in Paris. Lucien de Rubempre, a religious and royalist poet, has braved the fury of parties. He has come home, it is said, for repose after the fatigue of a struggle which would try the strength of an even greater intellectual athlete than a poet and a dreamer. There is some talk of restoring our great poet to the title of the illustrious house of de Rubempre, of which his mother, Madame Chardon, is the last survivor, and it is added that Madame la Comtesse du Châtelet was the first to think of this eminently politic idea. The revival of an ancient and almost extinct family by young talent and newly won fame is another proof that the immortal author of the Charter still cherishes the desire expressed by the words union and oblivion. Our poet is staying with his sister, Madame Séchard. Under the heading Angoulême followed some items of news. Our prefect, Monsieur le Comte du Châtelet, gentleman in ordinary to His Majesty, has just been appointed extraordinary councillor of state. All the authorities called yesterday on Monsieur le Préfet. Madame la Comtesse du Châtelet will receive on Thursdays. The mayor of Escarbas, Monsieur de Nègrepelisse, the representative of the younger branch of the d'Espard family, and father of Madame du Châtelet, recently raised to the rank of a count and peer of France and a commander of the Royal Order of Saint Louis, has been nominated for the presidency of the Electoral College of Angoulême at the forthcoming elections. "There," said Lucien, taking the paper to his sister. Eve read the article with attention, and returned the sheet with a thoughtful air. "What do you say to that?" asked he, surprised at a reserve that seemed so like indifference. "The Cointets are proprietors of that paper, dear," she said. "They put in exactly what they please, and it is not at all likely that the prefecture or the palace have forced their hands. Can you imagine that your old rival, the prefect, would be generous enough to sing your praises? Have you forgotten that the Cointets are suing us under Métivier's name, and that they are trying to turn David's discovery to their own advantage? I do not know the source of this paragraph, but it makes me uneasy. You used to rouse nothing but envious feeling and hatred here. A prophet has no honor in his own country, and they slandered you, and now in a moment it is all changed?" "You do not know the vanity of country towns," said Lucien. "A whole little town in the south turned out not so long ago to welcome a young man that had won the first prize in some competition. They looked on him as a budding great man." "Listen, dear Lucien, I do not want to preach to you. I will say everything in a very few words. You must suspect every little thing here." "You are right," said Lucien, but he was surprised at his sister's lack of enthusiasm. He himself was full of delight to find his humiliating and shame-stricken return to Angoulême changed into a triumph in this way. "You have no belief in the little fame that has cost so dear," he said again after a long silence. Something like a storm had been gathering in his heart during the past hour. For all answer, Eve gave him a look, and Lucien felt ashamed of his accusation. Dinner was scarcely over when a messenger came from the prefecture with a note addressed to Monsieur Chardon. That note appeared to decide the day for the poet's vanity. The world, contending against the family, for him had won. Monsieur le Comte Sixte du Châtelet and Madame la Comtesse du Châtelet request the honor of Monsieur Lucien Chardon's company at dinner on the 15th of September. RSVP. Enclosed with the invitation there was a card. Le Comte Sixte du Châtelet, gentleman of the bedchamber, prefect of the Charente, councillor of state. "You are in favor," said old Séchard. "They are talking about you in the town as if you were somebody. Angoulême and L'Houmeau are disputing as to which shall twist wreaths for you." "Eve, dear," Lucien whispered to his sister, "I am in exactly the same condition as I was before in L'Houmeau, when Madame de Bargeton sent me the first invitation. I have not a dress suit for the prefect's dinner party." "Do you really mean to accept the invitation?" Eve asked in alarm, and a dispute sprang up between the brother and sister. Eve's provincial good sense told her that if you appear in society, it must be with a smiling face and faultless costume. "What will come of the prefect's dinner?" she wondered. "What has Lucien to do with the great people of Angoulême? Are they plotting something against him?" But she kept these thoughts to herself. Lucien spoke the last word at bedtime. "You do not know my influence. The prefect's wife stands in fear of a journalist, And besides, Louise de Negrepelisse lives on in the Comtesse du Châtelet, and a woman with her influence can rescue David. I am going to tell her about my brother's invention, and it would be a mere nothing to her to obtain a subsidy of 10,000 francs from the government for him." At 11 o'clock that night the whole household was awakened by the town band, reinforced by the military band from the barracks. The Place du Murier was full of people. The young men of Angoulême were giving Lucien Chardon de Rubempre a serenade. Lucien went to his sister's window and made a speech after the last performance. "I thank my fellow townsmen for the honor that they do me," he said in the midst of a great silence. "I will strive to be worthy of it. They will pardon me if I say no more. I am so much moved by this incident that I cannot speak. Hurrah for the writer of The Archer of Charles IX! Hurrah for the poet of the Marguerite! Long live Lucien de Rubempre!" After these 3 salvos, taken up by some few voices, 3 crowns and a quantity of bouquets were adroitly flung into the room through the open window. 10 minutes later the Place du Murier was empty, and silence prevailed in the streets. "I would rather have 10,000 francs," said old Sechard, fingering the bouquets and garlands with a satirical expression. "You gave them daisies, and they give you posies in return. You deal in flowers." "So that is your opinion of the honors shown me by my fellow townsmen, is it?" asked Lucien. All his melancholy had left him. His face was radiant with good humor. "If you knew mankind, Papa Sechard, you would see that no moment in one's life comes twice. Such a triumph as this can only be due to genuine enthusiasm. My dear mother, my good sister, this wipes out many mortifications." Lucien kissed them, for when joy overflows like a torrent flood, we are fain to pour it out into a friend's heart. When an author is intoxicated with success, he will hug his porter if there is nobody else on hand, according to Bixiou. "Why, darling, why are you crying?" he said, looking into Eve's face. "Ah, I know, you are crying for joy." "Oh me!" said her mother, shaking her head as she spoke. "Lucien has forgotten everything already, not merely his own troubles, but ours as well." Mother and daughter separated, and neither dared to utter all her thoughts. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Evan David by Honoré de Balzac, translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Peary. Chapter 11. In a country eaten up with the kind of social insubordination disguised by the word equality, a triumph of any kind whatsoever is a sort of miracle which requires, like some other miracles for that matter, the cooperation of skilled labor. Out of 10 ovations offered to 10 living men, selected for this distinction by a grateful country, you may be quite sure that 9 are given from considerations connected as remotely as possible with the conspicuous merits of the renowned recipient. What was Voltaire's apotheosis at the Théâtre Français but the triumph of 18th century philosophy? A triumph in France means that everybody else feels that he is adorning his own temples with the crown that he sets on the idol's head. The women's presentiments proved correct. The distinguished provincial's reception was antipathetic to Angoumoisin immobility. It was too evidently got up by some interested persons or by enthusiastic stage mechanics, a suspicious combination. Eve, moreover, like most of her sex, was distrustful by instinct, even when reason failed to justify her suspicions to herself. "Who can be so fond of Lucien that he could rouse the town for him?" she wondered as she fell asleep. "The Marguerites are not published yet. How can they compliment him on a future success?" The ovation was, in fact, the work of Petit Claud. Petit Claud had dined with Madame de Senonches for the first time on the evening of the day that brought the cure of Marsac to Angoulême with the news of Lucien's return. That same evening he made formal application for the hand of Mademoiselle de la Haye. It was a family dinner, one of the solemn occasions marked not so much by the number of the guests as by the splendor of their toilettes. Consciousness of the performance weighs upon the family party, and every countenance looks significant. Francoise was on exhibition. Madame de Senonches had sported her most elaborate costume for the occasion. Monsieur du Hautoy wore a black coat. Monsieur de Senonches had returned from his visit to the Pimentels on the receipt of a note from his wife, informing him that Madame du Châtelet was to appear at their house for the first time since her arrival, and that a suitor in form for Francoise would appear on the scenes. Boniface Cointet also was there in his best maroon coat of clerical cut, with a diamond pin worth 6,000 francs displayed in his shirt frill, the revenge of the rich merchant upon a poverty-stricken aristocracy. Petit Claud himself, scoured and combed, had carefully removed his gray hairs, but he could not rid himself of his wizened air. The puny little man of law, tightly buttoned into his clothes, reminded you of a torpid viper. For if hope had brought a spark of life into his magpie eyes, his face was icily rigid, and so well did he assume an air of gravity that an ambitious public prosecutor could not have been more dignified. Madame de Senonches had told her intimate friends that her ward would meet her betrothed that evening, and that Madame du Châtelet would appear at the Hôtel de Senonches for the first time; and having particularly requested them to keep these matters secret, she expected to find her rooms crowded. The Comte and Comtesse du Châtelet had left cards everywhere officially, but they meant the honor of a personal visit to play a part in their policy. So aristocratic Angoulême was in such a prodigious ferment of curiosity that certain of the Chandour camp proposed to go to the Hôtel de Bargeton that evening. They persistently declined to call the house by its new name. Proofs of the Countess's influence had stirred up ambition in many quarters. And not only so, it was said that the lady had changed so much for the better that everybody wished to see and judge for himself. Petit Claud learned great news on the way to the house. Cointet told him that Zephirine had asked leave to present her dear Francoise's betrothed to the Countess, and that the Countess had granted the favor. Petit Claud had seen at once that Lucien's return put Louise de Negrepelisse in a false position, and now, in a moment, he flattered himself that he saw a way to take advantage of it. Monsieur and Madame de Senonches had undertaken such heavy engagements when they bought the house, that, in provincial fashion, they thought it imprudent to make any changes in it. So when Madame du Châtelet was announced, Zephirine went up to her with, "Look, dear Louise, you are still in your old home," indicating, as she spoke, the little chandelier, the paneled wainscot, and the furniture which once had dazzled Lucien. "I wish least of all to remember it, dear," Madame la Préfete answered graciously, looking round on the assemblage. Every one admitted that Louise de Negrepelisse was not like the same woman. If the provincial had undergone a change, the woman herself had been transformed by those 18 months in Paris, by the first happiness of a still recent second marriage, and the kind of dignity that power confers. The Comtesse du Châtelet bore the same resemblance to Madame de Bargeton that a girl of 20 bears to her mother. She wore a charming cap of lace and flowers, fastened by a diamond-headed pin. The ringlets that half hid the contours of her face added to her look of youth, and suited her style of beauty. Her foulard gown, designed by the celebrated Victorine, with a pointed bodice, exquisitely fringed, set off her figure to advantage; and a silken lace scarf, adroitly thrown about a too long neck, partly concealed her shoulders. She played with the dainty scent bottle hung by a chain from her bracelet. She carried her fan and her handkerchief with ease, pretty trifles, as dangerous as a sunken reef for the provincial dame. The refined taste shone in the least details, the carriage and manner, modelled upon Madame d'Espard, revealed a profound study of the Faubourg Saint-Germain. As for the elderly beau of the Empire, he seemed since his marriage to have followed the example of the species of melon that turns from green to yellow in a night. All the youth that Sixte had lost seemed to appear in his wife's radiant countenance. Provincial pleasantries passed from ear to ear, circulating the more readily because the women were furious at the new superiority of the sometime Queen of Angoulême, and the persistent intruder paid the penalty of his wife's offence. The rooms were almost as full as on that memorable evening of Lucien's readings from Chenier. Some faces were missing. Monsieur de Chandour and Amélie, Monsieur de Pimentel and the Rastignacs, and Monsieur de Bargeton was no longer there. But the bishop came, as before, with his vicars general in his train. Petit Claud was much impressed by the sight of the great world of Angoulême. 4 months ago he had no hope of entering the circle. To-day he felt his detestation of the classes sensibly diminished. He thought the Comtesse du Châtelet a most fascinating woman. "It is she who can procure me the appointment of deputy public prosecutor," he said to himself. Louise chatted for an equal length of time with each of the women. Her tone varied with the importance of the person addressed and the position taken up by the latter with regard to her journey to Paris with Lucien. The evening was half over when she withdrew to the boudoir with the bishop. Zephirine came over to Petit Claud and laid her hand on his arm. His heart beat fast as his hostess brought him to the room where Lucien's troubles first began, and were now about to come to a crisis. "This is Monsieur Petit Claud, dear. I recommend him to you the more warmly because anything that you may do for him will doubtless benefit my ward." "You are an attorney, are you not, monsieur?" said the august Negrepelisse, scanning Petit Claud. "Alas, yes, Madame la Comtesse." The son of the tailor in L'Houmeau had never once had occasion to use those 3 words in his life before, and his mouth was full of them. "But it rests with you, Madame la Comtesse, whether or no I shall act for the crown. Monsieur Milaud is going to Nevers, it is said." "But a man is usually second deputy and then first deputy, is he not?" broke in the Countess. "I should like to see you in the first deputy's place at once. But I should like first to have some assurance of your devotion to the cause of our legitimate sovereigns, to religion, and, more especially, to Monsieur de Villele, if I am to interest myself on your behalf to obtain the favor." Petit Claud came nearer. "Madame," he said in her ear, "I am the man to yield the King absolute obedience." "That is just what we want to-day," said the Countess, drawing back a little to make him understand that she had no wish for promises given under his breath. "So long as you satisfy Madame de Senonches, you can count upon me," she added, with a royal movement of her fan. Petit Claud looked toward the door of the boudoir and saw Cointet standing there. "Madame," he said, "Lucien is here, in Angoulême." "Well, sir?" asked the Countess in tones that would have put an end to all power of speech in an ordinary man. "Madame la Comtesse does not understand," returned Petit Claud, bringing out that most respectful formula again. "How does Madame la Comtesse wish that the great man of her making should be received in Angoulême? There is no middle course. He must be received or despised here." This was a dilemma to which Louise de Negrepelisse had never given a thought. It touched her closely, yet rather for the sake of the past than of the future. And as for Petit Claud, his plan for arresting David Séchard depended upon the lady's actual feelings towards Lucien. He waited. "Monsieur Petit Claud," said the Countess with haughty dignity, "you mean to be on the side of the Government. Learn that the first principle of government is this: never to have been in the wrong, and that the instinct of power and the sense of dignity is even stronger in women than in governments." "That is just what I thought, madame," he answered quickly, observing the Countess meanwhile with attention the more profound because it was scarcely visible. "Lucien came here in the depths of misery, but if he must receive an ovation, I can compel him to leave Angouleme by the means of the ovation itself. His sister and brother-in-law, David Séchard, are hard pressed for debts." In the Countess's haughty face there was a swift, barely perceptible change. It was not satisfaction, but the repression of satisfaction. Surprised that Petit Claud should have guessed her wishes, she gave him a glance as she opened her fan, and Francoise de la Haye's entrance at that moment gave her time to find an answer. "It will not be long before you are public prosecutor, monsieur," she said, with a significant smile. That speech did not commit her in any way, but it was explicit enough. Francoise had come in to thank the Countess. "Oh, madame, then I shall owe the happiness of my life to you," she exclaimed, bending girlishly to add in the Countess's ear, "To marry a petty provincial attorney would be like being burned by slow fires." It was Francis, with his knowledge of officialdom, who had prompted Zephirine to make this set upon Louise. In the very earliest days after promotion, so the ex-consul general told his fair friend, everybody, prefect or monarch or man of business, is burning to exert his influence for his friends; but a patron soon finds out the inconveniences of patronage, and then turns from fire to ice. Louise will do more now for Petit Claud than she would do for her husband in 3 months' time. "Madame la Comtesse is thinking of all that our poet's triumph entails," continued Petit Claud. "She should receive Lucien before there is an end of the 9 days' wonder." The Countess terminated the audience with a bow, and rose to speak with Madame de Pimentel, who came to the boudoir. The news of old Negrepelisse' elevation to a marquisate had greatly impressed the Marquise. She judged it expedient to be amiable to a woman so clever as to rise the higher for an apparent fall. "Do tell me, dear, why you took the trouble to put your father in the House of Peers," said the Marquise, in the course of a little confidential conversation, in which she bent the knee before the superiority of her dear Louise. "They were all the more ready to grant the favor because my father has no son to succeed him, dear, and his vote will always be at the disposal of the Crown. But if we should have sons, I quite expect that my oldest will succeed to his grandfather's name, title, and peerage." Madame de Pimentel saw, to her annoyance, that it was idle to expect a mother ambitious for children not yet in existence to further her own private designs of raising Monsieur de Pimentel to a peerage. "I have the Countess," Petit Claud told Cointet when they came away. "I can promise you your partnership. I shall be deputy prosecutor before the month is out, and Séchard will be in your power. Try to find a buyer for my connection. It has come to be the first in Angouleme in my hands during the last 5 months." "Once put you on the horse, and there is no need to do more," said Cointet, half jealous of his own work. The causes of Lucien's triumphant reception in his native town must now be plain to everybody. Louise du Châtelet followed the example of that King of France who left the Duke of Orleans unavenged. She chose to forget the insults received in Paris by Madame de Bargeton. She would patronize Lucien, and, overwhelming him with her patronage, would completely crush him and get rid of him by fair means. Petit Claud knew the whole tale of the cabals in Paris through town gossip, and shrewdly guessed how a woman must hate the man who would not love when she was fain of his love. The ovation justified the past of Louise de Negrepelisse. The next day Petit Claud appeared at Mme. Sechard's house, heading a deputation of 6 young men of the town, all of them Lucien's schoolfellows. He meant to finish his work, to intoxicate Lucien completely, and to have him in his power. Lucien's old schoolfellows at the Angouleme Grammar School wished to invite the author of the Marguerite and the Archer of Charles IX. To a banquet given in honor of the great man arisen from their ranks. "Come, this is your doing, Petit Claud," exclaimed Lucien. "Your return has stirred our conceit," said Petit Claud. "We made it a point of honor to get up a subscription, and we will have a tremendous affair for you. The masters and the headmaster will be there, and at the present rate we shall no doubt have the authorities too." "For what day?" asked Lucien. "Sunday next." "That is quite out of the question," said Lucien. "I cannot accept an invitation for the next 10 days, but then I will gladly." "Very well," said Petit Claud. "So be it then, in 10 days' time." Lucien behaved charmingly to his old schoolfellows, and they regarded him with almost respectful admiration. He talked away very wittily for half an hour. He had been set upon a pedestal, and wished to justify the opinion of his fellow townsmen. So he stood with his hands thrust into his pockets, and held forth from the height to which he had been raised. He was modest and good-natured, as befitted genius in dressing gown and slippers. He was the athlete wearied by a wrestling bout with Paris, and disenchanted above all things. He congratulated the comrades who had never left the dear old province, and so forth and so forth. They were delighted with him. He took Petit Claud aside, and asked him for the real truth about David's affairs, reproaching him for allowing his brother-in-law to go into hiding, and tried to match his wits against the little lawyer. Petit Claud made an effort over himself, and gave his acquaintance to understand that he, Petit Claud, was only an insignificant little country attorney, with no sort of craft nor subtlety. The whole machinery of modern society is so infinitely more complex than in ancient times, that the subdivision of human faculty is the result. The great men of the days of old were perforce universal geniuses, appearing at rare intervals like lighted torches in an antique world. In the course of ages, the intellect began to work on special lines, but the great man still could take all knowledge for his province. A man full cautelous, as was said of Louis XI., for instance, could apply that special faculty in every direction. But to-day the single quality is subdivided, and every profession has its special craft. A peasant or a pettifogging solicitor might very easily overreach an astute diplomat over a bargain in some remote country village, and the wiliest journalist may prove the veriest simpleton in a piece of business. Lucien could but be a puppet in the hands of Petit Claud. That guileful practitioner, as might have been expected, had written the article himself. Angouleme and L'Houmeau, thus put on their mettle, thought it incumbent upon them to pay honor to Lucien. His fellow citizens, assembled in the Place du Mûrier, were Cointet's work people from the paper mills and printing house, with a sprinkling of Lucien's old schoolfellows and the clerks in the employ of Messieurs Petit Claud and Cachan. As for the attorney himself, he was once more Lucien's chum of old days, and he thought, not without reason, that before very long he should learn David's whereabouts in some unguarded moment. And if David came to grief through Lucien's fault, The poet would find Angoulême too hot to hold him. Petit Claud meant to secure his hold. He posed, therefore, as Lucien's inferior. "What better could I have done?" he said accordingly. "My old chum's sister was involved, it is true, but there are some positions that simply cannot be maintained in a court of law. David asked me on the 1st of June to ensure him a quiet life for 3 months. He had a quiet life until September, and even so I have kept his property out of his creditor's power, for I shall gain my case in the Court Royal. I contend that the wife is a privileged creditor, and her claim is absolute, unless there is evidence of intent to defraud. As for you, you have come back in misfortune, but you are a genius." Lucien turned about as if the incense were burned too close to his face. "Yes, my dear fellow, a genius. I have read your Archer of Charles IX. It is more than a romance, it is literature. Only 2 living men could have written the preface, Chateaubriand and Lucien." Lucien accepted the eulogium, and did not think it necessary to mention that d'Arthez had written the preface. 99 writers out of 100 would have done the same. "Well, nobody here seemed to have heard of you," Petit Claud continued, with apparent indignation. "When I saw the general indifference, I made up my mind to change all that. I wrote that article in the paper." "What? Did you write it?" exclaimed Lucien. "I myself. Angoulême and L'Houmeau were stirred to rivalry. I arranged for a meeting of your old schoolfellows, and got up yesterday's serenade, and when once the enthusiasm began to grow, we started a committee for the dinner. 'If David is in hiding,' said I to myself, 'Lucien shall be crowned at any rate.' And I have done even better than that," continued Petit Claud. "I have seen the Comtesse du Châtelet and made her understand that she owes it to herself to extricate David from his position. She can do it, and she ought to do it. If David had really discovered the secret of which he spoke to me, the Government ought to lend him a hand; it would not ruin the Government. And think what a fine thing for a prefect to have half the credit of the great invention for the well-timed help. It would set people talking about him as an enlightened administrator. Your sister has taken fright at our musketry practice; she was scared of the smoke. A battle in the law courts costs quite as much as a battle on the field. But David has held his ground, he has his secret, they cannot stop him, and they will not pull him up now." "Thanks, my dear fellow. I can see that I can take you into my confidence. You shall help me to carry out my plan." Petit Claud looked at Lucien, and his gimlet face was a point of interrogation. "I intend to rescue Sechard," Lucien said, with a certain importance. "I brought his misfortunes upon him, I mean to make full reparation. I have more influence over Louise." "Who is Louise?" "The Comtesse du Châtelet." Petit Claud started. "I have more influence over her than she herself suspects," said Lucien. "Only, my dear fellow, if I can do something with your authorities here, I have no decent clothes." Petit Claud made as though he would offer his purse. "Thank you," said Lucien, grasping Petit Claud's hand. "In 10 days' time I will pay a visit to the Countess and return your call." They shook hands like old comrades, and separated. "He ought to be a poet," said Petit Claud to himself. "He is quite mad." "There are no friends like one's school friends. It is a true saying," Lucien thought as he went to find his sister. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Eve and David by Honoré de Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Bruce Perry. Chapter 12. "What can Petit Claud have promised to do that you should be so friendly with him, my Lucien?" asked Eve. Be on your guard with him." "With him?" cried Lucien. "Listen, Eve," he continued, seeming to bethink himself. "You have no faith in me now; you do not trust me, so it is not likely you will trust Petit Claud. But in 10 or 12 days you will change your mind," he added, with a touch of fatuity. And he went to his room and indited the following epistle to Lousteau: Lucien to Lousteau. My friend, of the pair of us, I alone can remember that bill for 1,000 francs that I once lent you; and I know how things will be with you when you open this letter too well, alas, not to add immediately that I do not expect to be repaid in current coin of the realm. No, I will take it in credit from you, just as one would ask Florine for pleasure. We have the same tailor, therefore you can order a complete outfit for me on the shortest possible notice. I am not precisely wearing Adam's costume, but I cannot show myself here. To my astonishment, the honors paid by the departments to a Parisian celebrity awaited me. I am the hero of a banquet, for all the world as if I were a deputy of the Left. Now, after that, do you understand that I must have a black coat? Promise to pay, have it put down to your account, try the advertisement dodge, rehearse an unpublished scene between Don Juan and Monsieur Dimanche, for I must have a gala suit at all costs. I have nothing but rags. Start with that. It is August, the weather is magnificent, ergo see that I receive, by the end of the week, a charming morning suit, dark bronze green jacket, and 3 waistcoats, one a brimstone yellow, one a plaid, and the third must be white. Furthermore, let there be 3 pairs of trousers of the most fetching kind, 1 pair of white English stuff, 1 pair of nankeen, and a third of thin black kerseymere. Lastly, send a black dress coat and a black satin waistcoat. If you have picked up another Florine somewhere, I beg her good offices for 2 cravats. So far, this is nothing. I count upon you and your skill in these matters. I am not much afraid of the tailor. But the ingenuity of poverty, assuredly the most active of all poisons at work in the system of man, id est the Parisian, an ingenuity that would catch Satan himself napping, has failed so far to discover a way to obtain a hat on credit. How many a time, my dear friend, have we deplored this? When one of us shall bring a hat that costs 1,000 francs into fashion, then, and not till then, can we afford to wear them. Until that day comes, we are bound to have cash enough in our pockets to pay for a hat. Ah, what an ill turn the Comédie Francaise did us with La Fleur, you will put gold in my pockets. I write with a profound sense of all the difficulties involved by the demand. Enclose with the above a pair of boots, a pair of pumps, a hat, 6 pairs of gloves. 'Tis asking the impossible, I know it. But what is a literary life but a periodical recurrence of the impossible? Work the miracle. Write a long article, or play some small scurvy trick, and I will hold your debt as fully discharged. This is all I say to you. It is a debt of honor, after all, my dear fellow, and due these 12 months. You ought to blush for yourself if you have any blushes left. Joking apart, my dear Lousteau, I am in serious difficulties, as you may judge for yourself when I tell you that Madame de Bargeton has married Chatelet, and Chatelet is prefect of Angouleme. The precious pair can do a good deal for my brother-in-law. He is in hiding at this moment on account of that letter of exchange, and the horrid business is all my doing. So it is a question of appearing before Madame la Préfete and regaining my influence at all costs. It is shocking, is it not, that David Sechard's fate should hang upon a neat pair of shoes, a pair of open-worked gray silk stockings, mind you, remember them, and a new hat. I shall give out that I am sick and ill, and take to my bed, like Duviquet, to save the trouble of replying to the pressing invitations of my fellow townsmen. My fellow townsmen, dear boy, have treated me to a fine serenade. My fellow townsmen, forsooth! I begin to wonder how many fools go to make up that word, since I learned that 2 or 3 of my old schoolfellows worked up the capital of the Angoumois to this pitch of enthusiasm. If you could contrive to slip a few lines as to my reception in among the news items, I should be several inches taller for it here. And besides, I should make Madame la Préfète feel that, if I have not friends, I have some credit, at any rate, with the Parisian press. I give up none of my hopes, and I will return the compliment. If you want a good, solid, substantial article for some magazine or other, I have time enough now to think something out. I only say the word, my dear friend. I count upon you as you may count upon me, and I am yours sincerely. Lucien de R. P.S. Send the things to the coach office to wait until called for. Lucien held up his head again. In this mood he wrote the letter, and as he wrote, his thoughts went back to Paris. He had spent 6 days in the provinces, and the uneventful quietness of provincial life had already entered into his soul. His mind returned to those dear old miserable days with a vague sense of regret. The Comtesse du Châtelet filled his thoughts for a whole week, and at last he came to attach so much importance to his reappearance that he hurried down to the coach office in L'Houmeau after nightfall in a perfect agony of suspense, like a woman who has set her last hopes upon a new dress, and waits in despair until it arrives. "Ah, Lousteau, all your treasons are forgiven," he said to himself as he eyed the packages, and knew from the shape of them that everything had been sent. Inside the hat box he found a note from Lousteau. Florine's drawing room. My dear boy, the tailor behaved very well, but as thy profound retrospective glance led thee to forebode, the cravats, the hats, and the silk hosen perplexed our souls, for there was nothing in our purse to be perplexed thereby. As said Blondet, so say we. There is a fortune awaiting the establishment which will supply young men with inexpensive articles on credit. For when we do not pay in the beginning, we pay dear in the end. And, by the by, did not the great Napoleon, who missed a voyage to the Indies for want of boots, say that, if a thing is easy, it is never done? So everything went well, except the boots. I beheld a vision of thee, fully dressed, but without a hat, apparelled in waistcoats, yet shoeless, and bethought me of sending a pair of moccasins given to Florine as a curiosity by an American. Florine offered the huge sum of 40 francs that we might try our luck at play for you. Nathan, Blondet, and I had such luck, as we were not playing for ourselves, that we were rich enough to ask La Torpille, des Lupeaulx's sometime rat, to supper. Frascati certainly owed us that much. Florine undertook the shopping, and added 3 fine shirts to the purchases. Nathan sends you a cane. Blondet, who won 300 francs, is sending you a gold chain, and the gold watch, the size of a 40-franc piece, is from La Torpille. Some idiot gave the thing to her, and it will not go. Trumpery rubbish, she says, like the man that owned it. Bixiou, who came to find us up at the Rocher de Cancale, wished to enclose a bottle of Portugal water in the package. Said our first comic man, "If this can make him happy, let him have it," growling it out in a deep bass voice, with the bourgeois pomposity that he can act to the life. Which things, my dear boy, ought to prove to you how much we care for our friends in adversity. Florine, whom I have had the weakness to forgive, begs you to send us an article on Nathan's hat. Fare thee well, my son. I can only commiserate you on finding yourself back in the same box from which you emerged when you discovered your old comrade, Etienne L. "Poor fellows, they have been gambling for me," said Lucien. He was quite touched by the letter. A waft of the breeze from an unhealthy country, from the land where one has suffered most, may seem to bring the odors of paradise. And in a dull life there is an indefinable sweetness in memories of past pain. Eve was struck dumb with amazement when her brother came down in his new clothes. She did not recognize him. "Now I can walk out in Beaulieu," he cried. "They shall not say it of me that I came back in rags. Look, here is a watch which I shall return to you, for it is mine, and, like its owner, it is erratic in its ways." "What a child he is!" exclaimed Eve. "It is impossible to bear you any grudge." "Then do you imagine, my dear girl, that I sent for all this with the silly idea of shining in Angouleme? I don't care that for Angouleme," twirling his cane with the engraved gold knob. "I intend to repair the wrong I have done, and this is my battle array." Lucien's success in this kind was his one real triumph. But the triumph, be it said, was immense. If admiration freezes some people's tongues, envy loosens at least as many more, and if women lost their heads over Lucien, men slandered him. He might have cried, in the words of the songwriter, "I thank thee, my coat." He left 2 cards at the prefecture and another upon Petit Claud. The next day, the day of the banquet, the following paragraph appeared under the heading Angouleme in the Paris newspapers: Angouleme. The return of the author of The Archer of Charles IX. Has been the signal for an ovation which does equal honor to the town and to Monsieur Lucien de Rubempre, the young poet who has made so brilliant a beginning, the writer of the one French historical novel not written in the style of Scott, and of a preface which may be called a literary event. The town hastened to offer him a patriotic banquet on his return. The name of the recently appointed prefect is associated with the public demonstration in honor of the author of the Marguerites, whose talent received such warm encouragement from Madame du Châtelet at the outset of his career. In France, when once the impulse is given, nobody can stop. The colonel of the regiment offered to put his band at the disposal of the committee. The landlord of the Bell, renowned for truffled turkeys, dispatched in the most wonderful porcelain jars to the uttermost parts of the earth, the famous innkeeper of L'Houmeau would supply the repast. At 5 o'clock, some 40 persons, all in state and festival array, were assembled in his largest hall, decorated with hangings, crowns of laurel, and bouquets. The effect was superb. A crowd of onlookers, some 100 persons, attracted for the most part by the military band in the yard, represented the citizens of Angouleme. Petit Claud went to the window. "All Angouleme is here," he said, looking out. "I can make nothing of this," remarked little Postel to his wife. They had come out to hear the band play. "Why, the prefect and the receiver general, and the colonel and the superintendent of the powder factory, and our mayor and deputy, and the headmaster of the school, and the manager of the foundry at Ruel, and the public prosecutor, Monsieur Milot, and all the authorities have just gone in." The band struck up as they sat down to table, with variations on the air Vive le Roi, Vive la France, a melody which has never found popular favor. It was then 5 o'clock in the evening. It was 8 o'clock before dessert was served. Conspicuous among the 65 dishes appeared an Olympus in confectionery, surmounted by a figure of France modeled in chocolate, to give the signal for toasts and speeches. "Gentlemen," called the prefect, rising to his feet, "the king, the rightful ruler of France, to what do we owe the generation of poets and thinkers who maintain the sceptre of letters in the hands of France, if not to the peace which the Bourbons have restored?" "Long live the king!" cried the assembled guests. Ministerialists predominated. The venerable headmaster rose. "To the hero of the day," he said, "to the young poet who combines the gift of the prosateur with the charm and poetic faculty of Petrarch, in that sonnet form which Paulo declares to be so difficult. Cheers. The Colonel rose next. Gentlemen, to the Royalist, for the hero of this evening had the courage to fight for sound principles. Bravo! cried the prefect, leading the applause. Then Petit Claud called upon all Lucien's schoolfellows there present. To the pride of the grammar school of Angoulême, to the venerable headmaster so dear to us all, to whom the acknowledgment for some part of our triumph is due. The old headmaster dried his eyes. He had not expected this toast. Lucien rose to his feet. The whole room was suddenly silent, and the poet's face grew white. In that pause, the old headmaster, who sat on his left, crowned him with a laurel wreath. A round of applause followed, and when Lucien spoke, it was with tears in his eyes and a sob in his throat. "He is drunk," remarked the Attorney General designate to his neighbor Petit Claud. "My dear fellow countrymen, my dear comrades," Lucien said at last, "I could wish that all France might witness this scene, for thus men rise to their full stature, and in such ways as these our land demands great deeds and noble work of us. And when I think of the little that I have done, and of this great honor shown to me to-day, I can only feel confused and impose upon the future the task of justifying your reception of me. The recollection of this moment will give me renewed strength for efforts to come. Permit me to indicate for your homage my earliest muse and protectress, and to associate her name with that of my birthplace. So, to the Comtesse du Châtelet and the noble town of Angoulême." "He came out of that pretty well," said the public prosecutor, nodding approval. "Our speeches were all prepared, and his was improvised." At 10 o'clock the party began to break up, and little knots of guests went home together. David Séchard heard the unwonted music. "What is going on in L'Houmeau?" he asked of Basine. "They are giving a dinner to your brother-in-law, Lucien." "I know that he would feel sorry to miss me there," he said. At midnight Petit Claud walked home with Lucien. As they reached the Place du Murier, Lucien said, "Come life, come death, we are friends, my dear fellow." "My marriage contract," said the lawyer, "with Mademoiselle Francoise de la Haye will be signed to-morrow at Madame de Senonches' house. Do me the pleasure of coming. Madame de Senonches implored me to bring you, and you will meet Madame du Châtelet. They are sure to tell her of your speech, and she will feel flattered by it." "I knew what I was about," said Lucien. "Oh, you will save David." "I am sure I shall," the poet replied. End of chapter 12.